Bikers harass 82-year-old veteran, have no idea who is watching. Frank Lawson was a creature of habit. Every morning, at exactly 7:45 a.m., he walked into Evelyn's Cafe, a small, cozy diner tucked into a quiet corner of the city. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the scent of warm pastries, and the gentle hum of chatter made the place feel like home. For the past 10 years, this cafe had been part of his routine. The staff knew him well, and the regulars respected him, even if they didn't know his full story. To them, he was just a quiet old man with a sharp mind. But today, something was different. As Frank settled into his usual seat by the window, nodding at Evelyn, the cafe owner, he sensed an unease in the air. The usual morning calm had been disturbed, and he wasn't the only one who felt it. From behind the counter, Evelyn hesitated before pouring his coffee. She glanced toward the back of the cafe, her face tight with worry. "Be careful today, Frank," she whispered under her breath, sliding the cup toward him. That was all Frank needed to hear. He didn't ask any questions. Didn't need to. He simply lifted the coffee to his lips, took a slow sip, and casually scanned the room. That's when he saw them. The first one came through the door like he owned the place. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, his leather jacket adorned with a biker insignia, a grinning skull with 2 crossed knives underneath. His boots clomped against the cafe's tiled floor as he stepped inside, followed by 5 more men, each one just as rough-looking as the last. Their presence was loud before they even spoke. They weren't just there for coffee. Frank exhaled quietly, keeping his focus on his newspaper. He wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble, it seemed, had just walked in. The gang leader, Razer, let out a mocking whistle as he looked around. "Real quiet in here," he said, smirking. One of his men, a lanky guy with greasy blonde hair, laughed. "Yeah, looks like a retirement home. No fun at all." The group made their way to a table near the back, shoving chairs aside like they were rearranging the place. Evelyn, ever the professional, walked over with a forced smile. "Coffee?" she asked politely. Razer leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Sure, sweetheart. And bring some sugar. This place could use a little sweetness." The other bikers snickered, their laughter carrying through the cafe. Frank stayed still, but his mind was working. He had seen men like this before. Bullies. People who thought strength came from how loud they were, how much fear they could spread. But Frank had learned something different in his time. Real strength? It was quiet. Controlled. And it didn't need to announce itself. Frank turned the page of his newspaper, pretending to read. That's when one of the bikers, a bearded brute with tattoos covering his arms, nudged Razer and nodded in Frank's direction. "Check it out," he said. "Old man's wearing a veteran hat." Razer smirked, then got up from his chair and strolled over to Frank's table, stopping just beside him. Frank didn't look up. "Hey, Grandpa," Razer said, his voice dripping with amusement. "That's a nice hat you got there." Frank took another slow sip of his coffee. Didn't respond. Razer's smirk widened. "What's the matter? Hard of hearing?" The other bikers laughed. Frank lowered his coffee cup, finally glancing up. His calm, steel-gray eyes met Razer's, and for the first time, the biker hesitated. Just for a split second. Then, like a man trying to prove he was still in control, Razer reached out and made a move to snatch Frank's hat off his head. Bad idea. Frank's hand shot up lightning fast, grabbing Razer's wrist before he could make contact. The grip was like iron, unshakable, firm, and far stronger than any 82-year-old man should have been able to manage. The entire cafe went silent. Razer's smirk vanished. His fingers twitched, trying to pull away, but Frank didn't let go. Frank's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and steady. "You don't want to do that, son." The other bikers shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. They hadn't expected this. And neither had Razer. Across the cafe, at a corner booth near the window, 3 men had been watching the whole thing unfold. Paul. Jackson. Race. They weren't regular customers. They were FBI agents. And more importantly, they were Frank's former students. Paul leaned forward, his jaw tightening. Is that who I think it is? Jackson, a tall man with sharp eyes, nodded slowly. That's him. Reyes let out a low whistle. Well, damn. Looks like these idiots just walked into the wrong cafe. The three men had trained under Frank Lawson years ago. Back then, he had been one of the top FBI instructors in the country, a specialist in combat tactics, de-escalation, and psychological warfare. They had seen him disarm men twice his size, take down entire squads in training drills, and teach agents how to control a room without saying a word. And right now, he was doing exactly that, without even standing up. Razer's hand twitched again, and for a brief moment, he looked unsure. Frank released his grip, his eyes never leaving the biker's face. Walk away, he said, his voice still even. I won't say it again. Razer rubbed his wrist, trying to mask his embarrassment with anger. You think you're some kind of tough guy? He snapped. Frank just picked up his coffee again, taking a slow sip. I think I gave you a choice. The other bikers were watching closely now, unsure of what to do. The whole cafe had gone completely silent, all eyes locked on the confrontation. And then, just when it seemed like things might escalate further, Paul decided to step in. The FBI agent stood up from his table, adjusting his suit jacket. Excuse me, he said, flashing a badge as he walked over. Razer's expression changed instantly. Paul nodded toward Frank. You see that man? That's the guy who trained me. And if you're smart, you'll walk out of here before you make a bigger mistake. The entire biker gang stiffened. For the first time since they entered, Razer looked unsure. He exchanged glances with his men, then gave a slow nod. Let's go, he muttered. They left without another word. As the door swung shut behind them, Paul turned back to Frank and grinned. Still got it, huh, sir? Frank smirked, finally setting down his coffee cup. Damn right I do. The tension in the cafe lingered even after the bikers had stepped outside. Conversations that had been abruptly cut off slowly resumed, but the energy had shifted. The cafe regulars, who had been watching the exchange with bated breath, murmured among themselves, exchanging glances filled with admiration and relief. Frank Lawson, however, wasn't celebrating just yet. He took another slow sip of his coffee, his eyes subtly flickering toward the window where the bikers stood outside, still muttering among themselves. Their exit hadn't felt like a retreat, it had felt like a delay. They weren't done. And Frank knew it. Paul, one of the three FBI agents sitting in the corner, leaned forward and kept his voice low and serious. They're not gone, sir, he murmured, eyeing the group outside. They're pissed. Frank didn't respond right away. Instead, he picked up a napkin and wiped the condensation from his coffee cup, his expression unreadable. You boys still play chess? He finally asked, his voice calm. Paul blinked. Excuse me? Frank gestured toward the bikers outside with a slight tilt of his head. See, the problem with guys like them, he said, is they think they're playing checkers. Jump a few pieces, knock a few guys around, and they think they're winning. But they don't see the bigger board. Reyes, the youngest of the three agents, frowned. And what board are we playing on? Frank's eyes hardened. One where I set the traps before they even know they're caught. Paul exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You never change, sir, he muttered. Frank smirked. Damn right I don't. Outside, Razer, the gang leader, was rubbing his wrist where Frank had grabbed him earlier. His face was still twisted in embarrassment, and his pride was clearly wounded. Man, are we just gonna let this old dude punk you out like that? One of his men, Snake, muttered, his voice low and edged with irritation. You let him do that in front of everybody. Razer gritted his teeth. You think I don't know that? He snapped. He turned his head slightly, staring back through the cafe window, his gaze locking onto Frank. He thinks he's some untouchable war hero, Razer muttered, shaking his head. He doesn't know who he's dealing with. So what do we do? Razor's lips curled into a smirk. We wait, he said. We let him think he's won. Snake frowned. And then? Then we teach him a lesson he won't forget. Back inside, Evelyn had finished serving another customer when she quietly approached Frank's table, her brow furrowed with concern. Frank, she whispered, glancing toward the window. I don't like this. He looked up at her, a small reassuring smile on his face. Neither do I, he admitted. You should leave, she insisted, before they try something worse. Frank let out a quiet chuckle. Evelyn, I've faced men more dangerous than that gang combined. You really think I'm gonna let a couple of bikers ruin my coffee? She sighed. You're impossible, you know that? Frank winked at her. So I've been told. The front door swung open again, the bell chiming loudly. For a split second, everyone froze, expecting the bikers to storm back in. But it wasn't them. Instead, it was a young man, late 20s, built solid, wearing a military jacket that looked a little too new to be from Frank's era. He had a tense posture, scanning the room like he was looking for something. Frank studied him instantly. Ex-military. Not gang-affiliated. Trained, but unsettled. The man spotted Frank, and his eyes widened slightly, like he recognized him. He walked over to Frank's table and hesitated before speaking. Sir? Are you Frank Lawson? Frank raised an eyebrow, setting his coffee down. Depends who's asking. The young man swallowed hard. My name's Alex Carter, he said. My dad served under you. Frank's expression softened slightly. Your father's name? Daniel Carter. Marine Corps. Said you saved his ass more times than he could count. Frank nodded slowly. He was a good man, he said. How's he doing? Alex shifted uncomfortably. He passed 2 years ago, he admitted. Cancer. Frank's jaw tightened, and for the first time that morning, he looked genuinely sad. I'm sorry, son. Alex exhaled sharply. He always told me, if I was ever in trouble, I should find you. Said you were the only man he ever met who didn't take crap from anyone. Frank studied the younger man for a moment. You in trouble, son? Alex hesitated, but before he could answer, the cafe door swung open again. The bikers were back. This time, Razer wasn't smiling. He stepped into the cafe, and everybody fell silent again. Paul, Reyes, and Jackson subtly reached for their belts, where their badges and weapons were concealed beneath their jackets. Frank simply exhaled, turning his head toward Razer. The biker slowly walked up to Frank's table, placing his hands flat on the surface. Didn't get the message, old man, Razer said, his tone lower and more menacing than before. Frank held his gaze, his expression unreadable. And what message was that? Razer smirked. That you don't belong here. Frank chuckled softly. Son, I was running missions before you were even born. If anybody doesn't belong here, it's you. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The bikers moved in closer, forming a loose semicircle around Frank's table. Paul clenched his jaw. You really don't want to do this, he warned, his voice carrying a hint of authority. Razer barely glanced at him. Stay out of this, suit. This ain't your fight. Frank, however, wasn't fazed. Instead, he took one last sip of his coffee, then set the cup down with a deliberate slowness. You want to start something, Razer? He said. Fine. He straightened in his seat, his posture suddenly shifting from relaxed to razor sharp. But you better finish it. For the first time, Razer hesitated. Frank wasn't afraid. He wasn't nervous. He was waiting. Like a man who had seen 100 fights and won every single one. And in that moment, Razer realized something. This wasn't a fight he could win. But that didn't mean he wouldn't try. The cafe was too quiet now. The usual background noises, clinking cups, casual chatter, the soft hum of the radio behind the counter, had disappeared. It was as if the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Frank Lawson, 82 years old and as steady as ever, sat unbothered. His fingers rested lightly around his coffee cup, his sharp gray eyes locked onto Razer, the biker gang leader who had just invaded his table. Across the cafe, Paul, Jackson, and Reyes sat at their booth, watching closely. They had seen this kind of tension before. But this time? It wasn't in a debriefing room or a training simulation. This time, it was real. Razer leaned in, placing both hands on the table, his fingers pressing into the wood. "You made a mistake, old man," he muttered, his voice low and simmering with rage. Frank took a slow sip of coffee. "What mistake would that be?" he asked, not even pretending to be intimidated. Razer smirked. "Thinking you could embarrass me in front of my guys and walk away." Frank set his cup down gently. "Son," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I've walked away from things that would have left you in pieces. But if you really want to push this..." His eyes hardened, locking onto Razer with an intensity that froze the air. "Just know that when you start something with me, you won't get to decide how it ends." The cafe felt smaller in that moment. Razer stiffened, his jaw twitching. The rest of his gang, 5 men in total, moved in closer, forming a tight semicircle around the table. Paul, Jackson, and Reyes exchanged glances. They had been waiting for this. And they were ready. As Razer reached for Frank's collar, something unexpected happened. Paul moved first, standing up abruptly. "That's enough," he said, his tone sharp as a blade. Jackson and Reyes followed suit, their posture tense. Razer's gang finally noticed them, turning toward the 3 men who had been sitting in the corner this whole time. Razer frowned, sizing them up. "You got a problem, buddy?" he sneered at Paul. Paul smirked slightly, but his eyes remained ice cold. "Not yet," he said. Jackson cracked his knuckles. Reyes grinned, but there was something dangerous behind it. "But we're about to," Reyes added. Frank let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "You fellas really should have picked a different cafe," he muttered. Razer's face darkened. "You think I'm scared of 3 suits?" he spat. That was when Paul did something that changed everything. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver coin, flipping it expertly between his fingers. Razer's smirk faded instantly. Because he knew exactly what that coin was. It wasn't just any coin. It was an FBI challenge coin. For those who didn't know, an FBI challenge coin wasn't something you could just buy. It was something earned. It was a symbol of loyalty, respect, and the kind of training that separated agents from the rest of the world. And right now, Paul was flipping it casually between his fingers, just to see how Razer would react. Razer's gang shifted uncomfortably, looking at one another. They weren't stupid. They had been in enough fights to know when they had the numbers and when they were outmatched in ways they didn't even understand yet. Razer tried to keep his cool, but his body betrayed him. His hands twitched slightly, and his nostrils flared. Paul smiled. "You sure you want to do this?" Paul asked, his voice casual. Razer gritted his teeth. "FBI?" he muttered under his breath. Frank chuckled again, shaking his head. "You're not real bright, are you, son?" Razer turned back to him, his anger flaring again. "You set us up!" Frank raised an eyebrow. "I didn't set up anything. You walked into the wrong cafe, you picked the wrong fight, and now you're looking for someone else to blame." Razer's fists clenched. His gang was visibly uneasy now, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. Jackson let out a sigh. "Tell you what," he said, rolling his shoulders. "How about we pretend this never happened? You walk out of here, and we don't ruin your whole week." Reyes grinned wider. "But if you don't?" He shrugged. "Well, let's just say you're gonna wish you had." Razer was stuck. If he backed down, his crew would see him as weak. But if he stayed? He was walking straight into a fight he couldn't win. Paul, Jackson, and Reyes weren't just cops. They were federal agents with military backgrounds and combat experience. And then there was Frank. A war veteran who had seen more violence than Razer could even imagine. Finally, Razer exhaled sharply, his jaw still tight with rage. "You're lucky," he muttered, taking a step back. Frank shook his head. Luck has nothing to do with it. Razer scowled, then motioned for his gang to leave. One by one, they backed away, their shoulders tense, their faces burning with humiliation. Paul watched them carefully, making sure they were actually leaving. Jackson didn't move until the last one was out the door. Reyes? He waved mockingly at them as they disappeared. Come back soon, boys, he called after them. We'll save a seat for you. Frank picked up his coffee again, taking a slow sip. Paul sighed, finally sitting back down. Well, Paul said, glancing at Frank. That escalated fast. Jackson smirked. You always did have a way of attracting trouble, sir. Frank chuckled. Guess I still got it. Reyes shook his head, grinning. I swear, Frank, you are the craziest old man I've ever met. Frank just smiled. That's what keeps me young. The cafe slowly returned to normal, the tension lifting, the background noise filling the air once again. But as Frank glanced out the window, watching Razer and his gang speed off, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. And next time? Frank Lawson had seen that look before. The look a man gave when he lost face in front of his people. Razer had backed off at the cafe, but not because he wanted to. He had done it because he had no choice. Frank knew men like him. They didn't take humiliation lightly. So, as the biker gang roared away from Evelyn's cafe, Frank wasn't relieved. He was waiting. Because he knew that men like Razer always came back. The air outside the cafe was crisp, the sun just beginning to dip behind the rooftops. Frank stepped out, adjusting his jacket. Paul, Jackson, and Reyes followed behind him. Well, Paul sighed, stretching his shoulders. That went smoother than expected. Jackson shook his head. You call that smooth? Nobody got shot, Reyes pointed out. I'd call that a win. Frank didn't comment. He just watched the street, eyes sharp and alert. Something felt off. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A black motorcycle, parked down the street, engine running. And the rider? He was watching them. Frank kept his body relaxed, but his mind sharpened instantly. Paul, he murmured. Paul followed his gaze, spotting the bike immediately. Yeah, he muttered. I see it. Jackson's jaw tightened. You think they're waiting for us to split up? Wouldn't be the first time. Reyes muttered, casually adjusting his jacket, a movement that just so happened to expose the FBI badge clipped to his belt. The biker didn't move. But Frank knew better than to assume he was alone. Let's take the back alley, Frank suggested, keeping his tone casual. Less traffic. Paul nodded, understanding immediately. Jackson and Reyes followed closely. As they turned the corner, leaving the main street behind, the air grew quieter, too quiet. And then, footsteps. Not loud, not clumsy, but deliberate. Someone was following them. Frank gave Paul a small glance, and in that silent exchange, Paul knew exactly what to do. Jackson and Reyes moved in sync, pretending not to notice. Then, just as they reached a narrow intersection, Frank stopped walking. Paul spun on his heel immediately, drawing his badge. All right. Paul's voice was sharp and firm. You've been tailing us since we left the cafe. So let's just cut to the part where you tell us what you want. Silence. Then, from the shadows, two figures stepped out. They weren't in biker cuts, no leather vests, no club insignia. But Frank recognized the type instantly. Not gangsters. Not drunks. Hired muscle. You should have stayed out of it, one of the men said, his voice cold and even. Paul raised an eyebrow. Out of what, exactly? You know what? The second man growled, taking a step forward. You embarrass Razer in front of his guys. That's not something a man like him forgets. Frank chuckled, shaking his head. I'm supposed to be worried about a boy with a bad haircut and a fragile ego. The first man's eyes darkened. You don't get it, do you, old man? You and your FBI friends just made a very big mistake. Paul, Jackson, and Reyes didn't react. They had spent years dealing with criminals who thought threats meant something. But Frank? He took one step forward, his hands in his pockets, looking completely unbothered. "You got a name, son?" Frank asked. The man didn't answer. Frank smirked. "That's a shame," he said. "Because if you did, I'd write it down. Then, when this all falls apart, I'd send your mom a nice letter telling her what happened to her dumb kid." The man tensed. Frank didn't wait for a reaction. "You go tell Razer that I'm still sitting at my favorite cafe, drinking my same coffee, not afraid of him," Frank said. "If he wants to come talk, he knows where to find me." The two men hesitated. Then, without another word, they turned and walked away. Paul sighed. "Well, that's gonna come back to bite us." Frank chuckled. "Yeah, probably." By the time Frank got home, the sky was fully dark, and the streetlights flickered dimly. His old two-story house stood at the end of the block, its front porch light glowing warmly. Too warmly. Someone had turned it on. Frank stopped at the gate, his eyes scanning the yard. He had lived alone for 20 years. Nobody turned on that porch light except him. A feeling settled in his gut. Slowly, he stepped inside, keeping the door slightly open behind him. He listened. The house was silent. But that didn't mean he was alone. His old instincts kicked in. Frank moved through the house carefully, checking the kitchen, the living room, the hall. Nothing. Then, as he stepped into the bedroom, he saw it. A single playing card sat on his nightstand. A joker. Frank picked it up, turning it over between his fingers. And there, written in bold black marker, was a message. "See you soon." Frank sighed. "Well," he muttered to himself. "Looks like we're playing games now." Frank didn't waste time. He grabbed his phone and dialed. Paul answered immediately. "Frank?" "They were in my house," Frank said. Silence. Then Paul's voice turned sharp. "How bad?" "They didn't take anything," Frank replied. "Just left me a little message." He held up the joker card, even though Paul couldn't see it. Jackson's voice came through the background. "They're trying to scare him. They're wasting their time," Frank muttered. Reyes spoke up. "You want us to come over?" Frank was silent for a moment. Then, finally, he smiled. "No," Frank said. "I've got a better idea." Paul hesitated. "What are you thinking?" Frank's grin widened. "I think it's time we go see Razer ourselves." The line went quiet for a second. Then Paul chuckled. "Now you're talking." Jackson let out a low laugh. "I was hoping we'd do this the fun way." Reyes smirked. "Let's pay him a visit." Frank took one last look at the joker card, then slid it into his pocket. He had played plenty of games in his lifetime. But this was one game Razer wasn't ready for. The night was cool and still, but Frank Lawson could feel the storm coming. Not in the air. Not in the weather. But in the way the world had suddenly gone quiet. The joker card in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just a threat. It was an invitation. An invitation Razer never should have sent. Frank stood outside his house, the glow from the porch light casting long shadows across the yard. He wasn't alone. Paul, Jackson, and Reyes stood beside him, all three tense, their eyes sharp with focus. "They broke into your house and just left a card?" Jackson asked, his voice low and cold. Frank nodded, holding up the joker card. "Didn't steal anything. Didn't trash the place. Just left this sitting on my nightstand." Reyes exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. "That means two things. One, they wanted you to know they were there. And two," Paul finished, "they think they're in control." Frank smirked slightly, slipping the card back into his pocket. "Then it's about time we show them how wrong they are." Paul crossed his arms. "All right, Frank. What's the play?" Frank turned his gaze toward the dimly lit streets of Riverstone. "Razer's pissed," he said. "Embarrassed. Humiliated in front of his crew. But instead of coming after me directly, he's trying to play mind games. Trying to make me second-guess myself. Jackson scoffed. He picked the wrong man for that. Damn right, Frank muttered. Which means we use that against him. Reyes grinned. I like where this is going. Frank turned to Paul. You still have access to that bureau surveillance software? Paul nodded. Yeah, but we need a valid reason to use it. Frank chuckled. How about a known gang leader making threats against a retired FBI instructor? Paul smirked. That'll do. Jackson cracked his knuckles. So we track Razer, find out where he's hiding, and what? Wait for him to make another move? Frank shook his head. No, he said, his voice firm. We don't wait. We go to him. Within 20 minutes, Paul had hacked into the town's surveillance feeds. His laptop sat on the hood of his car, the glow from the screen illuminating his face as he scanned through various street cameras. There, he said, pointing to the display. A warehouse on the outskirts of town. A place Razer and his gang used as their headquarters. Frank studied the image, his expression unreadable. How many of them? Jackson asked. Paul zoomed in on the footage. Looks like at least 10 outside, probably more inside, he said. They're watching the roads, probably expecting retaliation at some point. Frank smirked. Good. Let them think that. Reyes raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind, old man? Frank turned to face them all, his gaze steady. We're going in, he said simply. Paul stared at him. You mean like right now? Jackson folded his arms. Frank, I know you're not afraid of these guys, but 10-to-1 odds aren't exactly great numbers. Frank chuckled. Son, he said, I've been outnumbered worse than that before breakfast. But, Paul said, you're not doing this alone. Frank grinned. I was counting on that. The warehouse was exactly what Frank expected, rundown, poorly guarded in some places, and wide open for a smart infiltration. Razer's gang wasn't professional. They were thugs with loud engines and big egos, but they didn't know how to truly secure a location. Frank and his team used that against them. All right, Paul whispered, crouched beside Frank outside the fence. We've got at least 3 guys near the front. What's the move? Frank studied their surroundings, his mind already calculating angles, distractions, and timing. We make them come to us, he said. Jackson grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. Reyes reached into his jacket, pulled out a handful of firecrackers, and gave Frank a smirk. This too childish? Frank laughed softly. Son, I haven't seen those used in an op since '78. Light him up. Reyes snuck around the side, staying low as he moved. A few seconds later, pop, pop, pop. The sound echoed through the night, sharp and sudden. The gang members at the front immediately turned, their attention drawn to the noise. What the hell was that? One of them muttered, grabbing his gun. Go check it out, another said. That was all the distraction they needed. Paul, Jackson, and Frank slipped through the side gate, moving silently as ghosts. Inside the warehouse, the gang was relaxed, laughing and drinking, completely unaware of what was coming. At the back of the room, sitting on a makeshift throne of stolen goods, was Razer. He was drinking whiskey, looking pleased with himself. Frank didn't waste time. He stepped out of the shadows, walking straight toward him. The room went silent. Razer's eyes widened, but he recovered quickly, standing up and grinning. Well, well, Razer said. Look what we have here. Frank didn't blink. You made a mistake, boy. Razer's grin widened. That's so? You came into my house, Frank said. Left me a message. Thought you were being clever. He took another step forward. But you forgot something. Razer chuckled, his gang members starting to close in around them. And what's that? Frank smiled. You're not the only one who plays games. Before Razer could react, the entire front door of the warehouse burst open. Paul and Jackson stormed in, guns drawn. Reyes appeared from the catwalk above, aiming a flashlight directly at Razer's face. The gang members froze. Razer looked around wildly, realizing too late that he had just walked into a perfectly executed ambush. Frank smirked. "You see, kid," he said, "you came after me with amateurs." He motioned to his team. "I brought professionals." Razer's grin was gone. His face was red with fury, his hands clenched into fists. "You think this is over?" he growled. Frank tilted his head. "Oh, son," he said, his voice cool and calm. This is just the beginning." The warehouse had gone silent. Razer's gang stood frozen, their hands hovering near their weapons, trying to figure out whether to fight or flee. Paul and Jackson had their guns drawn, their FBI badges clearly visible, sending a very clear message. This wasn't just some street fight. This was federal business now. And Razer? For the first time that night, he looked unsure. Frank Lawson saw it. And he stepped forward, locking eyes with the biker leader. "You should have left me alone, kid," Frank said, his voice low and steady. Razer snorted, though his confidence wavered. "You think I'm scared of a bunch of old men?" he spat. Frank tilted his head, chuckling softly. "Son," he said, "you've got this all wrong. I'm not here to scare you." His gray eyes hardened, filled with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "I'm here to end you." Razer's hands clenched into fists, his gang shuffling uneasily behind him. He knew his options were limited. Surrender? Not a chance. Run? That would make him look weak. That left only one thing. Violence. Without warning, Razer lunged forward, swinging a wild punch toward Frank's face. It was fast. But Frank was faster. He ducked the strike easily, stepping to the side and catching Razer's wrist in a brutal, iron grip. Then crack. Frank twisted Razer's arm at just the right angle, forcing the biker to his knees in a split second. The entire gang jumped into motion, but Paul and Jackson were already there. Jackson slammed one guy against the wall, while Paul took down another with a precise joint lock. Reyes, positioned above on the catwalk, fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "Nobody move!" he barked. "I will drop the next one who breathes too hard." The gang froze. Razer, still locked in Frank's grip, let out a choked growl. "You!" he grunted, trying to yank himself free. Frank leaned in, his voice calm, even deadly. "Son, the difference between you and me?" he murmured. Razer snarled. Frank tightened his grip, making Razer grimace in pain. "I don't fight to win," Frank said. "I fight to end things. And right now, you're done." Paul stepped forward, snapping open his handcuffs. "You're under arrest," Paul said flatly. "For assault, breaking and entering, harassment, and whatever else we feel like throwing at you." Frank finally let go. Razer collapsed onto the floor, gasping. For a long second, the gang watched, waiting to see if their leader would get up. But Razer didn't move. And that was it. The moment of realization. Their leader was finished. One by one, the gang members dropped their weapons. Reyes sighed. "Well, that was easier than expected." Jackson dusted off his jacket. "Yeah. Thought they'd put up more of a fight." Frank gave a small, satisfied nod. They lost the second they walked into that cafe. The next morning, Riverstone felt different. The tension? Gone. Word had spread fast. Razer and his gang had been taken down, their leader hauled off in handcuffs, their members scattered like dust. For the first time in months, the town felt peaceful. Frank sat at his usual booth in Evelyn's cafe, sipping his coffee, his old routine restored. Paul, Jackson, and Reyes sat with him, their expressions relaxed for the first time in days. "Well," Paul said, setting down his mug. "That was fun." Jackson laughed. "For you, maybe." Reyes smirked. "I dunno, I kinda enjoyed it." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "You boys ever get tired of this kind of work?" he asked. Paul grinned. "Not yet." Jackson smirked. "You." Frank took a slow sip of coffee, then set his cup down. "No," he said. "I don't think I ever will." As they sat there, the door opened. A young man walked in, looking nervous, glancing around like he wasn't sure if he should be there. Frank recognized him instantly, one of Razer's younger recruits. He walked up to Frank's table, hesitating. Frank waited. Finally, the kid swallowed. I just wanted to say. He paused, struggling for words. I didn't know what we were getting into. I didn't know it would go that far. Frank studied him for a long moment. You looking for forgiveness, son? He asked. The kid nodded slowly. Frank gestured to the empty seat across from him. Then sit down, he said. And we'll talk about how you don't end up like your old boss. Paul, Jackson, and Reyes exchanged glances, small smirks forming on their faces. The kids sat down. And just like that, the story that started with a fight ended with something better. Something stronger. Something that lasted. Respect.